thanks to Lisa and Hala and to Jeff Brooks too for connecting us. Thanks for joining me today. I'm going to, I am not an academic, obviously, and some of this may be a little informal by the standards of your universities, but I will. I'm first gonna talk about kind of basically what I witnessed and wrote about in my book in the period of 88 to 91. Then I'm going to show some slides. I went looking for slides or things to shoot pictures of, and I just had a random selection of artifacts. So I'll go through those fairly quickly, and then at the end I'll just speak briefly and maybe tee up a discussion about what has happened since 1991, a whole lot, and what has happened in the last couple of months, again, a great deal, and what the implications of it are. So let me plunge right in. Some of this will stray beyond the Russian press, but it's all context for what happened in the press. And something that always has struck me as a sort of symbol of what happened at the time Gorbachev came to power was the map that journalists and diplomats from the West had. I inherited one in the Baltimore Sun's Moscow bureau. I didn't know who had bought it when, and it had no markings on it. It was one of these loose leaf book maps, which was an excellent Moscow street map. So you could look up any street and find it on the page, appropriate page, but it had no indication of where it had been published or by whom. And the reason was it was published by the CIA. And it was such a great map, and it was so much better than the Soviet maps, which by secrecy rules were distorted and limited because they thought it would give the enemy too much of an advantage in case of war. That all the Westerners seem to have these CIA maps. And, I was offered a lot of money for my CIA map by Muscovites, but I needed it, so I couldn't give it to them. And, as Gorbachev comes into power in 1985, that was the world that he was inheriting. The extent of information control was really hard to imagine today. To use a photocopier, dangerous thing like a photocopier, you needed to get special permission. Everyone was under lock and key. You had to have a good reason. It was all tracked. The censorship apparatus was very extensive and even extended. I was amused to find out to stand-up comedy. Comics had to submit their scripts for approval. As for the press, it was overseen by what everybody called Glavlit, which was an out-of-date acronym. The actual name for this institution, as you probably know, is Главное управление по охране государственных тайн в печати. The main administration for the protection of secrets in government secrets in state secrets, in the print. And editors had these big, newspaper editors had these big loose leaf notebooks of banned subjects, and they would get, mailings of like, take out page 300 and put in these new pages. And bureaucrats, of course, took huge advantage of this system, as they do in this country on a very, very different level. Secrecy increases the power of the bureaucrat, of the bureaucracy. And so they're only too happy to make everything secret. And one example that I remember from that era was that the fisheries ministry got the dumping of large quantities of fish from these sort of floating fish factories banned because it had gotten a little bit of press coverage, and that got people asking questions and they didn't like it. So they, got that added to the things that no one could write about. But of course, the feedback mechanism where, the press writes about a problem and there's pressure to fix the problem was completely broken. It was completely dysfunctional. So in 1985, in one memorable scene that has often been described, by both men, Gorbachev and Edvard Shevardnadze, the Georgian party leaders, Communist Party leader, were walking together on vacation at Pitsunda, one of these, kind of Politburo resorts on the Black Sea in early 1985, just before Gorbachev became general secretary. And one of them said, I think they both kind of said, "Tak žít nельзя," we can no longer live like this. And so out of that came perestroika, which was basically tinkering with the economy, trying to figure out how to breathe life, bring some market forces into the economy. That produced some, positive outcomes, at least on a small scale, like the co-op restaurants, essentially privately owned restaurants that started popping up in Moscow and St. Petersburg, or then Leningrad. But it also caused huge problems. I always remember an American economist who had studied the Soviet economy for years, who said that trying to turn the Soviet economy into a market economy was like trying to teach a penguin to fly. And that turned out to be the case. So there's perestroika, and there was also glasnost, the opening of the media, the kind of opening of information, which for my money was the more important change in terms of political consequences. It looked very simple, just unleash the press and make it function again. I think that's sort of the way Gorbachev thought it would work. But that underestimated the importance of what I came to call the Soviet illusion. The notion that people had been fed all their lives, that all was going well with the system. There were temporary difficulties, as they like to call them, but everything was pretty great. That children were very fortunate to have been born in the world's first socialist country. That the capitalist West was just plagued with troubles, and at some point, in the near future, was going to collapse. Another journalist had called this phenomenon the Soviet pretense, and there certainly was an element of pretense in it, but I thought that missed an important element, which was that most people, even the most educated, the most cynical, found that they actually had accepted and believed almost at an unconscious level, a visceral level, much of what the system had taught them. They knew something about Stalin and his crimes. They knew something about Western economies, but they had never confronted touchy subjects like those directly and in detail because of the excellent work of Glavlit, the censors. And all of that changed basically overnight, not literally overnight, but I guess over the course of a year or so. I built the beginning and end of my book around my friend Andrei Mironov, a human rights activist about my age, who I got to know extremely well. And he visited us here in Baltimore. And we visited him in Russia. But in 88 to 91, I got to know him early on, and he was very helpful to me, and we became very close friends. He had been one of the last Soviet political prisoners. He was arrested in June 1985, a few months after Gorbachev came to power, mainly for photocopying banned books, even things like George Orwell's 1984, and spreading them around to friends. But in the months after he was imprisoned, which is 85 into 86 to the beginning of 87, his mother, quite desperate, of course, started sending clippings from the official press, which had begun to broach previously forbidden topics, to the KGB in the town where she lived in Izhevsk, and to Gorbachev himself. She's writing to Gorbachev. I'm sure he never saw this, but she sent Gorbachev a 28-page handwritten letter in October of 1986, saying of Andrei, her son, he is accused in connection with things that all our newspapers have written about during the last 2 years. The KGB, for example, had said that Andrei had expressed the seditious opinion that corruption is flourishing in Russia, in the Soviet Union. And she wrote in her letter, his mom wrote, there have been many newspaper articles about corruption and the reasons for its emergence and spread, citing 2 pieces in Literaturная Gazeta. Incidentally, looking back at this, I realized that one was by Yuri Shekachikhin, who was poisoned, murdered, assassinated with poison in 2003, in which, in retrospect, was probably a taste of what was going to come in the Putin era. Anyway, Andrei Mironov was released in February 1987. There was an amnesty, and that was when the opening of the media was really gaining momentum. And so by the time I arrived in April of '88, it was already well underway. Something really important about this revolution, something extraordinary, I think maybe unprecedented, is that it was led from the top by essentially the same regime that was responsible for information control. This was a top-down decision. Gorbachev decided we're going to do this, which meant that there were huge resources available for the reporting of accurate information. It wasn't like dissident reporters had to fight their way in, or there were news startups. All of the state's massive printing and broadcasting resources began to shift more or less, depending on which one you're talking about, in the direction of, depicting reality accurately and, basically functioning normally as journalists ought to function. Although, of course, not without resistance, inertia, rearguard actions. But basically, the state paid journalists to switch from censored propaganda to increasingly genuine news. The biggest areas for the new journalism might be divided into 4 categories: history, problems of the society, politics, and previously touchy subjects. I'm going to go over each of these and give you a few details. And the rest of the world, the outside world, especially the West. Never has there been such a paradox, to take the first one first, history. Never has there been such a paradox as history filling the front pages of newspapers. But that's what happened, I think, especially of the daily feature in Вечерняя Moskva, Evening Moscow, the Evening Moscow paper, called, if I remember right, Portraits of the Repressed. It's just a standing feature every day. And there'd be half a dozen photos of people who had been sent to the camps under Stalin, or who had simply been killed by the Stalin regime, with a little background on their lives, their names, ages, professions. So that, it was an effort to kind of restore non-people to the historical record. And it was just the regular daily paper. And there it was on the front page. And Вечерняя Moskva, the newspaper, had been prompted to start that feature after writing about a guy who I also wrote about named Alexander Milchakov, who there was a new reform-minded Moscow City Council, and they had appointed him as chairman of a commission to research Moscow's mass graves. So he was actually going around with volunteers, digging up places and finding mass graves from the Stalin era. And soon, naturally, he was at odds with the KGB, and this same evening paper, the Moscow Evening Paper, had a headline, Duel, D-U-E-L, a fight, Alexander Milchakov versus the KGB, because they were withholding documents and he was fighting to get them. And of course, all of a sudden he had the newspaper, the local newspaper, on his side. He had a tool to work with against the KGB. And ultimately, he basically won. He said in an interview printed in that same paper, whether we like it or not, from the building on Dzerzhinsky Square stretches a historical trail of millions of crimes, a sea of blood. And his campaign in the press forced the KGB to begin to release to him records of people who had been executed under Stalin. There was the second category, problems. There was new, sometimes quite bold reporting on problems of all kinds, from pollution to corruption to police brutality to Dyedovshchina, the vicious hazing of military recruits. It was a huge problem back then, and still is today. There was reporting on politics, because all of a sudden there was politics. I never know whether that's plural or singular. In 1989, there were the first competitive elections to the Soviet parliament in history, and I'll show you a little clip a little later from that. And the newspapers dutifully ran biographies and platforms of the candidates, who included people like Andrei Sakharov, the dissident physicist, who had spent years in internal exile until Gorbachev freed him. there was an explosion of discussion of previously censored topics like sex. That had always been considered unacceptable by the prudish censors. And, these sort of fly-by-night Russian publishers discovered that sex sells. And so there was a lot of that going on. And there was one of the most powerful things that happened was there was lots of reporting and lots of visual imagery about the rest of the world, in particular the West. And I'll also talk about that in a minute. Now, of course, the restrictions and the heavy hand of editors, those habits, the editors who'd been trained in censorship for decades did not disappear overnight. Some newspapers and magazines remained timid and dull. There was a guy named Yegor Ligachov, who was a conservative in the Politburo, who kind of fought a rearguard action. And I remember there was a piece that ran in Pravda when Gorbachev was on vacation or something, and it looked like this guy Ligachov was trying to fight back. But generally speaking, the trend was overwhelmingly in one direction. Some of the papers, some of the publications got very bold, and you always look forward to a new edition because there would be something exciting to read about. So what was really striking about that period also was this was not just something journalists were paying attention to or government officials. There was an intense, explosive public interest in all this new stuff. Ogonyok, which was sort of a life magazine for the Soviet Union, if that means anything to you, saw its circulation take off from 600,000 to 3 million. We'll look at a few images of Ogonyok in a minute. Komsomolskaya Pravda, the newspaper of the Komsomol, the Soviet Communist youth group, hit 20 million. Argumenty Fakti, Arguments and Facts, still exists, topped out around 3.5 million. I think now it has like a 2 million, sells about 2 million copies. 35 million copies. At that time, it was supposedly, it was given a Guinness World Record as the most widely circulated publication in the world. And this was not just a dry parade of circulation numbers. It was just, it's hard to convey how dramatic a time it was when you grab the latest issue of a newspaper to kind of see what have they done now? What have they dared to do now? There was an old Soviet tradition of posting newspapers behind glass, page by page by page, for those who did not or could not buy a copy, and you could stand at a bus stop or whatever and read it on the street. But now when they posted Moskovsky Novosti, not far from where my apartment was, Moskovsky Novosti, Moscow News in particular, was hot stuff. And there would be a pushing, shoving crowd around the glass cases for hours while people tried to read some of the stuff that was there. My secretary, I had a kind of secretary in my bureau. There was basically a secretary and a driver, both supplied by UPDK, which I think may still exist, but anyway, it was the group that provided workers to the diplomatic corps and to the foreign press, who, of course, had a report to the KGB regularly on what they saw. But anyway, she subscribed at her home, to Argumenty Fakti, and she had her mailbox jimmied twice by somebody who clearly really wanted to read Argumenty Fakti. So, can you imagine that an official Soviet newspaper is in such demand, somebody's willing to break the law and break into somebody's mailbox to get it? So what was happening in newspapers was, of course, happening across the realm of public information, of content, as we say, horrible word that we use today in journalism. Previously forbidden books of the kind Andrei Mironov had photocopied were suddenly appearing on book tables outside and inside the metro in Moscow. I have an old list of the most popular books for 1989 based on a vote by readers of Knizhnoye Obozrenie book review, official publication about books, that has lots of books that literally 5 years ago were available only in samizdat, self-published, and could send you to prison. Poetry and prose by Vladimir Vysotsky, the hugely popular gravel-voiced singer who had often been censored, was #1. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, Gulag, was #5. Жизнь и судьба, Life and Fate by Vasily Grossman was #9. Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was #10. Bulgakov's Master and Margarita was #11, and so on. All stuff that was not available previously. Filmmakers kept on breaking taboos too, about history, about politics, about sex. There are some wonderful films from that era. And then there's TV, which I want to just linger on a little bit. As you know, the Soviet ideological chieftains had always understood the importance of television, which was why all over the Soviet Union, outside the cities, it was easy to find village houses with no running water and a TV antenna on the roof. The government was investing in some things and not others. But now that huge broadcasting infrastructure under Gorbachev's new orders, it was still in place, but the fences came down. And one of the most popular new programs was a Friday evening program called Vzгляд, Viewpoint or Glance. And it became a huge hit, a mega hit, with these cool young guys in sweaters sitting around on sofas talking live about current events, with occasional news reports or film clips or musical performances, so on. A little bit like the Daily Show, but less formal, and more serious at times. Sometimes it was funny, sometimes it wasn't. But it was the absolute polar opposite of Vremya, the old Soviet evening news show. One riveting report on Vzгляд came from a camera person sent to West Germany, who simply walked up and down the aisles of a supermarket showing what was for sale. Nothing special, but it blew people's minds. I talked to people about it. Most Soviet viewers had never seen the inside of a Western grocery store, and they were astonished. They were amazed. And that kind of thing did attest the overall effectiveness of Soviet information control. The fact that such a glimpse of Western life could shock in that way. But the most memorable TV appearance in my experience came from the live broadcast of the first session of the first elected Soviet parliament, 1989. The Olympic weightlifter Yuri Vlasov, a huge hero to many Soviets because of his performance in the Olympics years earlier as a weightlifter. He had won a seat just as a celebrity from Moscow, and took the microphone on May 31st, 1989, with millions watching live. We'll watch a little clip of this later. Somebody calculated that GDP dropped by a third or something like that during the broadcasts of that first parliament, because so many people just stopped working to watch. Gorbachev was presiding. He seemed to think Vlasov was going to speak on corruption in sports, which was something he'd recently written about with the new Glasnost. But Vlasov clearly had decided to take full advantage of the opportunity to speak to virtually the entire adult population of the Soviet, or certainly of the European Soviet Union, of the big cities anyway, either live or in replays, and later in the day, in the evening. He attacked coverage on Vremya, said it showed political bias, even though it was cleaning up its act a little bit. He said the country needed an impeachment law after the killing of 16 Georgian demonstrators by the army, clearly implying that Gorbachev should have been ousted as a result. And Gorbachev's sitting there listening to this. He lambasted the state of the economy and its inability to stock store shelves with food. But it turned out that all that was just a warm-up, and he tore into the KGB, which he accused of crimes unknown in the history of mankind. Again, this is live TV, of being a real underground empire that has still not yielded its secrets. Speaking of Lubyanka, the KGB headquarters, he said, for decades, orders for the annihilation or persecution of millions of people were issued from that building. He said it needed to be taken away from the KGB. And to his sort of coup de grace at the end, he quoted the Russian writer Pyotr Chadaev, a friend of Pushkin, who had famously written, "We are an exceptional people, the Russians. We are among those nations that, as it were, are not members of mankind, but exist only to give the world some terrible lesson." And Vlasov concluded, "Let there be no more of this terrible lesson." So what happened? It's hard not to think about the invasion of Ukraine and of Russia teaching the world some terrible lesson, right? We'll get to that. But in the short run, after this explosion of information, the consequences were colossal. It's my argument in my book that certainly a lot of people would dispute that it was the immersion in the problems of the Soviet system, the failures of that system, the corruption of the economy, the incompetence of the Communist Party, the lies that had been told about history, the obvious gap in living standards with the West, that all that just had a powerful political effect. And when the KGB and the reactionaries tried to pull off a coup against Gorbachev, of course, in August of 1991, and talk about incompetence of the system, I mean, that was an incredibly incompetent coup. It was too late. It led instead to the Soviet collapse. And I believe that was because people wouldn't put up with it, including some of the military that had been brought to Moscow and ended up protecting Yeltsin instead of arresting Yeltsin. The 90s that followed, of course, saw an explosion of inflation, of scams and frauds, of street crime, chaos. And perhaps some of that was inevitable in the dissolution of autocratic rule, but it was deeply unnerving, infuriating for many ordinary Russians. And therefore they welcomed Putin, about not quite a decade later, the handpicked successor of Yeltsin, who, after all, had vanquished the old system and who was relatively young, certainly by Soviet standards, energetic, smart. He was not a drunk like Yeltsin. And of course, he was formerly KGB. And there were a lot of debates at that time about whether that was a good idea or bad idea. And a lot of our Russian friends, including certainly Andrei Mironov, were extremely skeptical about the idea of having a former KGB guy in charge. And it turns out for very good reasons. So now I'm going to share my screen and show you these slides real quick. Let's see. Here we go. So let's see. Okay, so this is the Ogonyok, that magazine. In May of 9th of May, of course, is Victory Day, celebrates the victory in World War II. The day, which Putin allegedly wants to have some kind of victory to show in Ukraine by May 9th, so they can have a big parade and celebrate. Anyway, this is 1985, before any of the changes started, and that was the kind of thing you saw in Ogonyok. Oops. Okay, I think I've gotten a little out of order here, but I'll just run through them anyway. Somebody gave this to me. This is 1981. It's, as most of you I'm sure can read, it says the list of books that are not, basically allowed to be distributed in the book selling network. So it's a long, long list. It's like, I don't know, quarter inch or half an inch thick. Just a list of all the books you were not allowed to sell in 1981. This is part of the sort of Gorbachev perestroika propaganda effort. The whole propaganda effort was turned in the direction of perestroika and glasnost. And this is, of course, in English. They kind of almost photoshopped out his birthmark, which they did early on. October and perestroika, the revolution continues. This was Gorbachev's effort to say all these reforms were simply to strengthen the communist system, the Soviet system. Okay, back to Ogonyok. This is 3 years later, September of 1988. And this was quite a splash. This is a place called Kuropatty Woods outside Minsk. And the headline says, "Look around," basically. And that was a demonstration. You can see the picture of Stalin, and they dug up old pictures and they unearthed the bodies of many people slaughtered and buried in a mass grave there. And so this kind of happy, patriotic, heavily censored magazine became, quite sensational at times. Here's another one in 1991, 3 years after that. After the big presidential elections and parliamentary elections in 91, there's Gorbachev and Raisa heading to the polls to vote themselves. And these are crowds around the polls and so on. But then it's interesting, the lower one on the left is basically, people fighting each other. And there's kind of like street shoving matches over the elections. So, just include that to show you how these elections are being celebrated and how they didn't censor that there were some kind of rough edges. Here's that book review list of, it wasn't really bestsellers, so they weren't counting that, but it was a vote of readers of this publication as to what were the best publications of 89. This is a closer look at that list. And you see that it has on it not just things like Solzhenitsyn and Grossman, but also has, The Count of Monte Cristo by Dumas. It has Jane Eyre by Bronte. So it was also, there's Gone with the Wind is on there. So, it wasn't all politics, but the political part of it was quite revolutionary. Okay, now this is my only video clip, and this is Vlasov. I'll show you the beginning, and then I'll fast forward to the part about the KGB. So this is the weightlifter who I mentioned speaking on live TV to millions and millions of people across the Soviet Union.
Представляется депутату Власову Петровичу, город Москва.
Уважаемый председатель, уважаемые депутаты, я избран от Люблинского района Москвы.
Okay, now I'm just going to fast forward to where he...
Правды не найти, искать ее опасно. Манипуляции с якобы психической ненормальностью
He's talking about KGB now. Look how people react.
Демократическое обновление страны не изменило место КГБ в политической системе. Этот комитет осуществляет всеохватный контроль над обществом, над каждым в отдельности. В системе же министерских отношений он явно поставлен над государством, подчиняясь лишь узкой аппаратной группе. Назначение председателя КГБ должно проходить через съезд народных депутатов. Народные депутаты должны знать численность этой организации и требовать отчета за все нарушения законности, знать ее бюджет. И лучше бы...
Now that's very limited applause. Very small part of the hall is clapping, as you can see.
И лучше бы перенести службу КГБ с площади Дзержинского. Уж очень незабываема кровавая история главного здания, где покоится меч, защищающий народ. Отсюда десятилетиями исходили приказы по уничтожению или преследованию миллионов людей. Горе, стон, муку сеяла эта служба на родной земле.
Okay, so you get the idea. A couple more things. This is the, I guess, Tsarina and one of the kids, who were killed, the royal family who were murdered by the Bolsheviks when they came to power. They became kind of popular again. And this was just a photograph, an old photograph that I bought on a table in Moscow. They were, just part of the kind of recovery of history. And this was anecdotes about sex, jokes about sex, a little pamphlet crudely printed being sold on a table in Moscow. So it wasn't all high-minded stuff. The final thing I wanted to share with you, I use this as the frontispiece of my book because I think it's so amazing. I'm sure some of you have read Life and Fate by Grossman, but it just so connected to that period of time that I'm just going to read it aloud. You can read along. My dear comrades, Madyarov said suddenly, can you imagine what it's like to have freedom of the press? One quiet morning after the war, you open your newspaper and instead of exultant editorials, instead of a letter addressed by some workers to the great Stalin, instead of articles about a brigade of steel workers who've done an extra day's work in honor of the elections to the Supreme Soviet, instead of stories about workers in the United States who are beginning the new year in a state of despondency. Remember Jeff Brooks' image from his talk, poverty and growing unemployment. Guess what you find in the newspaper? Information. Can you imagine a newspaper like that? A newspaper that provides information. Of course, this is set in the 40s during the war. And so you start to read crop failure in Kursk region, an inspection report on conditions in Butyrsky prison, a debate on whether the White Sea-Baltic Canal is really necessary. You read about how the worker Golopizov opposes the issuance of new bonds. In general, you know everything that's happening in the country. Good harvests and crop failures, enthusiasm and breaking and entering, the opening of new mines and mine disasters, the disputes between Molotov and Malenkov. You read reports on the course of a strike set off when a factory director fired a 70-year-old chemist. You read the speeches of Churchill and Bloom, and not that they stated that allegedly. You read the reports of the debates in the House of Commons. You know how many people committed suicide yesterday in Moscow, and how many people were taken to Sklifosovsky emergency room to be stitched up. You know why there's no buckwheat groats in the stores, and not just that the year's first strawberries have just been delivered from Tashkent to Moscow by air. You know how many grams of bread a collective farm worker gets per working day from the newspaper and not from the cleaning woman whose niece from the village has come to Moscow to buy bread. Yes, yes, and on top of that, you remain fully and completely a Soviet citizen. You go into the bookstore and buy a book remaining a Soviet citizen. You read American, English, French philosophers, historians, economists, political observers. You figure out for yourself where they're wrong. You yourself, without a nanny, walk the streets. All at once, Sokolov brought his fist down on the table and said, "Enough! I emphatically and insistently demand that you stop such talk." And if you don't know the story, Life and Fate Grossman submitted for publication in one of the so-called fat journals, the literary journals, because of course in 1961, this was during the thaw under Khrushchev, and he actually thought you might be able to publish this massive novel that essentially equates Stalin and Hitler. And not only was it rejected, but it was turned over to the KGB, and they destroyed all known manuscripts. They tried to wipe this thing off the face of the earth. But Grossman, no fool, had given a copy on microfiche to, I think it was an Austrian diplomat who had taken it abroad. So it was first published abroad in 1980 and finally published in the Soviet Union in 1988 when we were living there, and immediately became a bestseller. And I think the only thing Grossman might have been wrong about was he says, yes, yes, and on top of that, you remain fully and completely a Soviet citizen. As it turned out, the Soviet system as constructed was incompatible with that kind of information. And I think that's my claim, at least, is that's how things fell apart. And that's what I wrote about in this book. You can probably buy it from, I love Better World Books. You can probably buy it somewhere for like $1. But if you're interested in that period, find a copy. Anyway, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I just have, I just want to briefly open the discussion to talk, talking about more recent times. And I think, I'm sure you know all this. What happened to the media was, in the 90s, it was no utopia by any means. The corruption that attached to so much of Russian life, you remember the privatization and the emergence of oligarchs and so on, it certainly reached the media. Journalists told me about publications that were perfectly willing to sell a positive profile of, say, a business or an oligarch, or to take money to kill a negative story. So it was hugely imperfect. I always used to laugh at there was a kind of stock phrase that Russian journalists used. Maybe they still use it today, but according to unverified information, it's like, according to unverified information, Putin has cancer or something like that. It's like, well, wait a minute. If it's unverified, should you really be printing it? But anyway, it was still very interesting and certainly for me heartbreaking to watch Putin, who was still dressed in a semi-democratic costume early on, to find new ways to exert control that didn't seem quite to be drawn from the Soviet playbook. He would pressure an oligarch to buy up the shares in a company controlling a newspaper or a TV channel. And the new management that he had installed would exert editorial control in favor of whatever the Kremlin told them to favor. And so gradually TV lost its edge, lost its independence. Everybody probably remembers the show Kukli that Putin had shut down because it made fun of him and other politicians. And over the years, Putin increasingly dropped any pretense of democracy and simply strong-armed the media. It got much more like the Soviet system. But I always thought for years, I thought he was clever to allow a few steam valves to remain. Echo Moskvy, the radio station, Dost, the TV network or TV station, TV channel, Novaya Gazeta. It appeared to me that he had calculated correctly that as long as he controlled, what the Soviets would have called the commanding heights of the media, meaning state television, a few smaller outlets that were critical and reached mostly highly educated city dwellers wouldn't matter. He could always, and he could use that to his advantage. He could always point to them and say, hey, we got freedom of the press, say, to point to foreign visitors, whoever, say, look at that, they're calling me names and they don't like what I'm doing, and they're still allowed to function. But the diversity of viewpoints certainly gradually disappeared from the broad range of the press. And gradually the reintroduction of draconian prison sentences and assassination as a means of control, and more importantly, as a deterrent, limited the operations even of the boldest journalists. You don't have to kill very many people or imprison very many people, journalists, before the other journalists kind of get the message and either look for other work or toe the line. And of course, in the last couple of months, as we've seen with the Ukraine invasion, those few outlets that remained, independent outlets, were shut down. The fact that Putin will not allow anybody to call this war a war brought to mind the fact that during the entire Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which was the subject of extensive coverage in the Soviet press, the word missile never appeared. It was a whole crisis threatening world war over nuclear missiles that had been stationed in Cuba, but the word missile never appeared in Soviet coverage. So we're back to that. In some ways, I think we're almost back earlier than that. Given the threat of 15 years in prison or worse, we're not only back before Gorbachev, but we're in some regards back in the Stalin period. I mean, we'll have to see how it plays out, but certainly the threats are severe, though technology may make it difficult to control the information reaching people who really want to know what's going on. The problem is most people are busy with their lives, busy with their jobs, and they're not willing to make the effort, or they don't have the capability to make the effort to find out what's really going on. The last point I'll make for discussion, I spent a couple of years at the New York Times covering what I thought was the quite brilliant and quite effective influence campaign that Russia ran against the US election.
Scott, hello, can you hear us?
I know that Scott had a sort of not entirely dependable internet connection before we started, so it could be that that's the culprit.
Okay, we'll give him a minute to log back in.
Yeah, I think he was he was going on to his concluding remarks anyway. So if anyone has questions that they were planning on asking, sort of, you can get those ready while we get Scott back on.
I think he will rejoin
He
us.
will, yeah. He logged off, he logged
out.
and he logged back in.
Yeah. My gosh, it's so extraordinary to have such a speaker who has seen really the Russian press go full circle from the 80s to the present. Okay, he's rejoining us. Excellent.
I was going to say he's brilliant
He absolutely brilliant.
before he came back on. There it is.
Oh. Okay, excellent. Yeah.
Hey, I'm sorry.
It's all right.
I don't know what happened.
Yeah, I just lost it.
Okay, our internet went out.
Came right back on.
Where did I lose you? I guess, anyway, I was talking about the 2016 election. Did you hear some of that? Okay.
Yes.
So anyway, the last point I wanted to make was that a large swath of the American public believes Trump won the 2020 election. If they wanted to make the effort to find out, they would find out that that's not true. And unlike the Russians, we cannot blame the state control of the media, state-funded disinformation campaign. We're free to watch and listen to anything we want. And yet that still happens. I remember very early on the Trump presidency, I think maybe even when he was president-elect, there was a Russian journalist who watched an early press conference of President-elect Trump and said, basically, welcome to my world. So I find myself quite alarmed and depressed by the state of information and disinformation today, not just in Russia, but in the US. And I think there are some connections between the two. So anyway, I will shut up now, and I would love to hear what anyone thinks about any of that stuff.